Hi, welcome back. So I just made a video about the future of the meta of Honkai Star Rail. If you haven't checked it out, you should. However, while everything I said in the video is true, I did feel like some of the stuff I said I didn't actually agree with 100%. And I feel as if I just said them so I can say something agreeable in the video. So, in this video I'm going to be talking about Powercreep of course, but this time, specifically why I personally don't see it as an issue, mostly. Hopefully in this video I can convince everyone to calm the f down, but hey, everyone is definitely not gonna watch this, so I'll just explain my reasoning as to why Powercreep isn't that big of an issue in a game like Honkai Star Rail. Before we start, you should like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this in the future, and join the Express Rain Discord server for a fun Star Rail community to interact with, as well as any updates on Star Rail news. Also, I'm trying to reach 2,500 subs before the end of the year, so I'd appreciate it if you were part of the journey. Now let's get on to it. So, first things first, why exactly do I think power creep isn't that big of an issue? Well, my biggest reason for this is because people like seeing big damage numbers. Back during 1.0, the biggest damage we saw was from Zila and possibly Himiko or Clara in some scenarios, but I don't recall most people seeing any damage above, let's say, 150-200k. This at the start of any gacha game is totally normal. There isn't a standard that the first or second DPS characters have to follow, but there is a standard they have to set. And when the next DPS character coming out doesn't meet the standard or is subpar, people are obviously not going to pull for them. This is exactly what happened with Jing Yuan, since the damage he was doing wasn't more than Zila's damage, and he also had a problem that still exists to this day but will actually be fixed when Sunday comes out, and that is his Lightning Lord is too slow, which is the main source of his damage of course. Now, you could, of course, still zero cycle with Jing Yuan back in the day, but that's because, as always, the MOC cycle that comes out will cater to the newest character, and so they will feel more powerful. When so many players express their dissatisfaction and disappointment in a character that doesn't break the standard of DPS, the devs are going to be pushed to making the next DPS character stronger, which is what they did with Blade, who was stronger than Jing Yuan when he came out, but this is no longer the case because of all the indirect buffs Jing Yuan got, and especially again when Sunday comes out. Anyways, when Blade came out, he was about on par with Zila's level, but also didn't have any of the disadvantages Jing Yuan had back in the day, so people did of course pull for him. The brand new DPS who also had a really nice amount of survivability with the MOC catering to him. However, he also didn't break any standards and people were again dissatisfied. Until Dylan Jingliu came out and then they broke the standards and set new ones on their own, and so the older DPSs became less viable or a tiny bit more useless. The reason why is obvious. Zila was still doing max 200k with max buffs, while Dan Honggael and Jingliu were doing that in their sleep, especially because again, the MOC cycle catered to them. Now, not only did players stop using Zila because she wasn't as good as the new DPS characters, but also because seeing low damage is not satisfying. Now this should be incredibly obvious. When the new DPS doesn't break the standard, the old DPS set they don't get pulled for. They don't even have to exactly be worse than the older DPS for players to not pull for them. They just have to be just as effective or a little more effective in some situations and a little less in others. People are going to bitch about it anyway. Players want to not only see these characters beating the endgame content, they want to see these characters do bigger damage than the character before. And if that doesn't happen, they won't pull, which is what happened with Jing Yuan and Zila. Neither was exactly better, both were just better or worse depending on the situation, so people who pulled Zila didn't pull for Jing Yuan, so when the devs see this, they will obviously start making their characters stronger. Now I'm not saying this is a scientific breakthrough that only the HSR devs have figured out, this has obviously been happening for decades ever since the first gacha game came out. The devs didn't exactly see Jing Yuan wasn't doing well, and then buffed up the next DPSs more. They obviously planned for this because they know that was going to happen. Now, in the lifespan of any other gacha game, it would take multiple years or multiple patches for the older characters to become less viable. I mean, if every other new DPS was only, let's say, a 50k to 100k damage improvement over the DPS before, it would take a pretty long time for enemy HP to ramp up so much that the older characters become useless. Where it becomes an issue and why most HSR players are worried is when a really strong and accessible mechanic comes out, like Hyper Blooming Genshin and of course Superbreak and HSR. Both are incredibly accessible and incredibly powerful. After both of their releases, we got another highly scaling DPS, however in the case of HSR there's a lot more nuance in Genshin. Team building in HSR versus in Genshin is very different, let me explain. Hypercarry in Honkai Star Rail needs more than just a support that can really buff up the main damage dealer. So while Sunday is very good for this archetype, he's still not enough to truly revive it. Hypercarry needs a sub-DPS support that can deal supplemental damage between the main damage dealer's turns while buffing up the main damage dealer a lot. Something like Jade, but a lot more powerful and not just tied to modes like Pure Fiction. Meanwhile, something like a Hutai Hypercarry team in Genshin has Xingqiu and Xiangling that do a lot of damage. When I made this video where I ranked the best DPSs in Star Rail, I ended up crowning Acheron as the best DPS. However, Acheron's best team is still not going to perform better than Fei Xiao's best team in their respective best case scenarios, but don't get me wrong, they're still both incredibly powerful and very close in these respective best case scenarios and will still both zero cycle. Although as of recording this video, Fei Xiao's best support, Robin, is at least 5 bajillion times better than Acheron's best dedicated support, which is currently Jiaozhou. Now of course you can use Robin with Acheron, but Acheron doesn't take full advantage of Robin's kit like Fei Xiao does. So the end result is Fei Xiao will perform better, so when Acheron eventually gets her own SS tier support, because so far Jiaozhou is only S tier at his best, she's going to be better. Another reason why Fei Xiao teams are so good is because not only does everyone in the team deal some pretty damn good damage unlike Acheron's teammates, but because Robin also deals exponentially more damage the more attack your characters do, and Acheron's teammates do like 1/4 of the attacks as a Fei Xiao team would. So a teammate that can do exactly what I explained earlier would be insane for the current state of HSR, reviving older units like Dylan Jingliu even more than someone like Sunday would, and then would also be pretty good for Acheron if they're a debuffer instead of a buffer. Now, Superbreak also allows all other party members to start dealing insane amounts of damage as well, which is why it's also very good. If Superbreak was a buff to only the main damage dealer in the party, it would be so much weaker than it is. I honestly think Harmony MC should have just buffed one character to make the archetype a lot more balanced, but hey, here we are. Another example is when looking at the difference between Firefly's best team and Boothill's best team, we see Firefly uses Harmony MC while Boothill uses Bronya. The damage Boothill does every single one of his turns when he gets advanced through Bronya, in his best case scenarios as single target enemy, is significantly more than the damage a Superbreak team would do. However, Firefly is still better than Boothill in non-single target scenarios because she synergizes so well with Superbreak, and especially with Superbreak's preferred sustains, Linkshot and Gallagher, who are both fire types and work a lot better with Firefly than they would with Boothill, or someone like Rappa in scenarios where the enemies aren't fire weak, because as we all know, Firefly implants a fire weakness. So, because Superbreak's best teams all include teammates that do a shit ton of damage, in their best case scenarios they're going to out DPS Boothill, Acheron, and Fei Xiao. However, those three still out DPS Superbreak in their best case scenarios. The best DPS is all about who has the most best case scenarios and the most SS tier support. So, I wouldn't worry about older characters being useless just yet, especially because of Sunday, who would, even though be most useful in summon meta teams, will still make Dill, Jingliu, and especially Jingyuan deal a lot more damage. Actually, Jingyuan may actually enter the top 10 or even top 5 DPSs because of Sunday, we'll just have to see what happens. Also, if you Dill and Jingliu mains wants a little bit more hope, then in 2.7 the MOC will feature the Bug Boss again, whose best counters will of course be Dill, Jingliu, and Rappa, and this will reinforce the point I'll be making later on in the video. So, to recap, because this section was pretty long, gacha games, and especially one like HSR where the skill gap is very small, the only difference between a good character and bad character are their multipliers, people like to see big damage numbers because it's simply satisfying. When damage numbers are comparable to the damage done by the previous DPS, people will pull less. And in the case of Superbreak and FUA, not only do they do really big damage, but they do really big damage very frequently, which is also very satisfying to watch and very good. And so, the large section of the player base that plays for meta will almost only pull for characters that power creep, and so games adopt power creep to properly profit. These games are predatory, they're gonna want to gain as much money as they can from you. The only problem here, and what I absolutely agree with, is when we got easily accessible mechanics that are very powerful like Superbreak and Star Rail, or in Genshin's case, Hyper Bloom, which really speed up the power creep curve and make it so older characters are less powerful than the new standard much faster. My next point is, while so many people make the case that they want to use older characters because they really like these characters, but let's be honest, using the same teams over and over and over again is going to get really boring eventually, at least in my opinion, which is why I think it's a good thing. It may be argued that you can just create a new team comp without power creeping older ones, but this goes back to the previous point, where it's less satisfying to get a brand new team comp that isn't more effective than the current team comp you're using. And on the other side, when enemies in endgame modes don't get any harder, and while yes they can make it harder through mechanics, when enemies just have the same amount of HP, it kinda gets boring after a while having to do the same amount of damage over and over again. Of course though, I can't just ignore that enemy HP is indeed skyrocketing way too quickly. Kafka in the 2.5 MOC had 1.2 million HP, while the puppets in the current MOC have 3.7 million HP in total. Svarog in the 2.6 MOC, coming in about 2 weeks, is going to have 1.3 million HP, while in the 2.7 MOC, the same Svarog is going to have 2.3 million HP, while the elite enemies in the 2.7 MOC almost have as much HP as Boss Kafka herself at around 800k each. While sure, it's a greater challenge, it's a pretty exponential curve. However, I bet you if Svarog is going to be insanely easy to beat with the Kafka and Black Swan team, I'm going to do exactly that. Now, if I'm proven wrong, I'll personally apologize, but until then, it seems insanely easy to do because of the weaknesses. Svarog has an insane amount of characters that can counter him. However, that's not really what people are arguing, so what I think is going to happen is that after they stop selling Superbreak and start selling the Summon meta, since Harmony MC will now be busy being Remembrance MC, players without Fugue will obviously not be able to use Superbreak, and when Superbreak isn't usable, they're not going to put many more break effect or Superbreak buffs in these endgame modes, and without those endgame buffs, Superbreak is a lot weaker, which means the enemy HP curve will probably stop increasing so exponentially, especially when we also get enemies that counter Break as well. Also, as some added evidence that without endgame buffs Break will be a lot weaker, let's take a look at the current Pure Fiction and the previous Apocalyptic Shadow rotations, where DOT is and was heavily buffed. Now, Superbreak teams were nowhere near as good as DOT teams against Phantylia in the previous Apocalyptic Shadow rotation, and right now players without DOT teams are suffering in Pure Fiction, especially those that don't have Acheron either. Not to mention the fact that Superbreak players without Ruan Mei will really suffer in this current Pure Fiction cycle because enemies get advanced forward when they're attacked, which reduces their damage a lot of course. They can quite literally pick and choose which mechanics to buff based on what they're feeling each fortnight. So I myself am not worried at all about the fact that endgames are catered to this or that enemies have so much HP, just invest horizontally. Now of course, this doesn't at all negate the fact that 1.x characters are still pretty useless, and even if I think using the same characters over and over again can become incredibly boring, some people still want to only use their favorite characters, and justifiably so, and that sometimes means using older characters. For those people, then I still have hope. Because it's a turn-based game with a limited number of mechanics they can make, they're not going to neglect one mechanic for way too long. We have many promising looking characters in the leaks, and many promising mechanics that may buff up older characters a lot, so I would have hope if I were you. I mean, of course, I'm repeating myself over here. The rate that Powercreep has been happening in Star Rail is incredibly fast, compared to something like Genshin, which was introduced to Hyperbloom in 3.0, so I absolutely get why some people are worried. However, people are attributing this way too much for Powercreep itself and not to what's been happening to Star Rail specifically, which is Superbreak. Powercreep in and of itself happens to every game and it's not necessarily a problem, of course not in my opinion for the reasons I mentioned in this video. Superbreak should have been a lot weaker than it turned out to be, but hey, we can't do anything about that now. In 3.0, when Remembrance Trailblazer is out, Superbreak will be used less as people want to start using Remembrance Trailblazer more, and the only source of Superbreak will now be Fugue. And by the way, Fugue is actually not really stronger than Harmony MC at all. She's actually almost exactly as good or a little worse than Harmony MC and Firefly teams. Okay, hold up. Hi, Moose from the future, I guess you could say. So I did say that Fugue was slightly worse than HMC in certain situations, but that was before she actually got buffed in V3 and V4. I was talking out of my ass here, basically. So, she's actually, after the V3 and V4 buffs, 12% better than Harmony MC. So, you guys who are replacing Harmony MC, you don't really need to worry about your Firefly becoming worse. This 12% difference still isn't enough to make Superbreak insanely powerful more than it already is, it's just enough to be there. She's better in every team, but if you're not planning on pulling for Remembrance, which is honestly kind of a mistake if you play for meta, then you really shouldn't get Fugue unless you want two Superbreak teams. And at that point you kinda got bigger problems going on in your head because Superbreak is insanely boring. So while people are busy using the new and fun meta, Superbreak could become a tiny little bit weaker when it comes to Firefly, depends on if they buff Fugue in V5 or not. So as I said, I'm pretty hopeful. I don't think things are as bad as people say. If you disagree with anything said in this video, make sure to tell me in the comments. Also, if you have any suggestions as to what video I could make next, because I'm truly out of ideas, I would also really appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this in the future. Join the Express Rain Discord server. Remember, I'm trying to reach 2,500 subs before the end of the year, so let's make it happen. I'd really appreciate it. Anyways, I will see you next time.